Welcome to Curious City, the podcast from Glasgow Life Museums. I'm David Scott, and this is how it works. In each episode, we travel across the city, discovering objects from our collections that link in surprising ways. Our team have been out at museums and locations around the city, uncovering the stories that surround us. Who knows where we'll go and what we'll see this time? As our guest this week, we welcome fashion historian, writer, curator and Glasgow School of Art research fellow Mairi MacKenzie. Mairi, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am a fashion historian. What that is, it's not the history of what was in fashion, but it's the history of everything to do with fashion and textiles. I always loved clothes. I'm from Stranraer. There weren't many clothes shops there, so it was Woolworths. I knew which rah-rah skirt I wanted. I knew what I wanted from the catalogue. I just had a very definite idea about fashion. I studied history at Glasgow University, and that gave me a really good grounding in the context of all fashion and textiles.
Before we say where we are this week, Mairi, can I ask you, are you somebody who likes a museum?
I love museums. I don't remember spending much time in them when I was younger, but as I got older, even as a place to just go and sit, even if it's not to look at the objects, there's something very relaxing for me about museums.
And are there any favourite museums or any favourite pieces in Glasgow that you have?
Well, we're in the Burrell collection. It's absolutely gorgeous. But I often think I would like to live in the Burrell. I think it's a beautiful building. It's all killer, no filler. And the way the interpretation done is excellent.
We've given it away. We're at Burrell this week and we're all about fashion and costume. But before we explore Burrell, we're going to head off to Riverside to look at our first object. Mairi, this one, without giving too much away, how would you describe this next object?
It is a very particular vision of the future that was made in 1966.
Let's have a look. Graham, welcome. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, David.
Thanks for coming along today. Graham, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do?
My background is really from the theatre, starting in the theatre as a stage manager and designer, and then I moved over to sort of set design, costume design, then prop making, and then moved from the theatre into television a bit, and then from television into filming, concentrating on period costumes, 1600 to the 1940s, 50s. I have my own costume collection of menswear dating from the 1740s right through to the 1940s, which I've collected for nearly 40 years. So I have original examples of items that I can either copy or let people borrow to copy. So I've got a great reference collection of original pieces.
Graham, you're a costume designer, so who do you design costumes for?
Various television companies, BBC, all the sort of independent companies, museums, film and other project. You're only as good as your last job, so you've got to give 100%.
You mentioned film there. You'd worked on the latest Indiana Jones film when they were in Glasgow. Yes. What was that like?
That was a fantastic experience. A lovely designer, Joanna Johnson, who put us in charge of organising all the crowd in Glasgow, a 1969 crowd of 500 or 600 people dressed in 60s American costume. We had a fantastic time filming that in the centre of Glasgow, dressed as New York 1969. And I also did quite a lot of buying for them, buying of 60s clothes that we managed to find quite cheap in Glasgow, which was a fascinating experience. 500
costumes, well, how tricky was that?
It wasn't too bad. 60s costumes are quite readily available still. You can still find 60s stuff, but earlier stuff's more difficult to find now. Stuff from the 40s, 30s back, it's much more difficult to find these pieces. You can still find 60s and 70s stuff and 80s stuff, but any earlier than that now you're struggling to find good pieces, good original pieces.
A good link into our next object, the story that brings us here today, Graham. We're standing in front of a Paco Rabanne dress that was worn by Audrey Hepburn in the 1967 film Two for the Road. Can you describe the dress for us?
It's a fascinating dress, typical 60s shape, quite short, just above the knee I think when it would be worn, but it's made incredibly out of a whole lot of circular discs, silver perspex or plastic discs that are silverised. Quite a spectacular dress.
What might this dress tell us about the character who's wearing it?
She's very up-to-date, very modern. It's almost a sort of 60s version of Thoroughly Modern Millie. Probably quite a strong character, I would say, to wear a dress at that period.
What can costume do in a film? It's not simply clothes for characters to wear. What can costume do to help tell the story?
It creates the flavour of the period, creates the flavour of the time, gives you a bit of background to the character, gives you a feel for the character itself. It's quite complex. Every project is different and every director is different what they want on the actor.
How might a character's costume change over the course of a film?
It can change quite radically, either due to if the film requires the costume to be broken down, to be distressed as time goes on, maybe over a matter of weeks or a matter of years.
And what kind of challenges does that pose you?
It's always quite difficult if you're trying to keep the continuity the same. One scene you're filming might happen at the beginning of the film, and then the next scene the next day could happen at the end of the film. So you've got to have maybe 2 or 3 costumes in different processes of breakdown. So one that's brand new and one that's maybe broken down or falling to bits for later on in the film.
We've talked about the effect costume can have on us as viewers in terms of our perception of a character, but what effect can costume have on the actor?
My experience of actors is if you're doing a period project, they're mostly quite fascinated in the fact they're wearing something they've never worn before, and they're quite intrigued by it. So through these little bits like glasses, pens, or watch chains, walking stick, well, it helps them to create the character, because actors love to play around with bits and pieces and props as well. So anything you can combine with the costume that seems to help them as well.
You mentioned your own collection. Is that a collection you're continuing to add to?
It's continued to add to all the time, yep, always finding something, mostly menswear, because it's rarer to find, it doesn't survive as much, especially hats, trousers, jackets, coats, all sorts of bits and pieces.
And what sort of places will you find these pieces?
Everywhere from the Barrows in Glasgow, the market, to charity shops, to jumble sales in the old days, used to get stuff at jumble sales, to auctions, to eBay.
Have you got any tips for any budding costume designers?
Do your research. It's very important to do your research. Read up as much as you can of period history. Look at people on the street. I always look at folk in the street, whether modern day or whatever. It's fascinating observing people and what people wear in the street you wouldn't get away with in a TV film. They would say, oh, that's far too outrageous, but real life is more outrageous than television and film.
How long have we been seeing fashion in film then?
Since the very beginning, all actors need to be costume. There is a distinction though between costume and fashion. They do overlap. Costume, it's about telling a story, it's about creating a character. Fashion is more for the general public.
Are you a film fan?
Yes, I love films very much.
Any recent films or highlights where costume features that you can tell us about?
The Barbie film. It was absolutely outstanding, the amount of research that went into it. They went into the archives, looked at all the old Barbie costumes and recreated them pretty faithfully, I think, for the film. And again, that was a really good storytelling device. For
our next object, we're going to move downstairs. One of the most striking and the most popular paintings here at Burrell is called The Rehearsal. The rehearsal shows just that, a ballet rehearsal with a dozen or so dancers in full costume. Mairi, are paintings ever a frame of reference for your own work?
Portrait painting in particular is a very valuable source in the study of fashion history. It captures a moment in time. We can assume that it's the sitter's own clothing that is being worn. It captures it before photography was around to document what people wore. So it's very useful indeed. And also in my own research, I use paintings as a way of understanding Scottish fashion history. At the moment I'm studying the work of the artist Stephen Campbell. And the depiction of cloth and clothing in his paintings really captures something of Scottishness and the context within which he was painting at that time.
Well, the rehearsal painting is a great segue into our next object. Our next object is a tutu. Now, it's not currently on display in any of our museums, but that's not going to stop us. Alan has been over to the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre in Nitshill to find out more about a special tutu and talk about the link between costume and performance.
I'm surrounded by thousands of boxes containing dresses, shoes and costumes, each with their own unique story. The reason I'm here in the textile store at Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre is to meet with the curator responsible for this collection.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Quinton. I'm the curator for European Dress and Textiles here for Glasgow Museums. This store is where we keep all the textile objects that are not currently on display. There's probably about 20,000 items in here, ranging from very early Coptic pieces right the way through to modern contemporary dress. And we are slowly improving the cataloguing and storage of it and trying to rationalise it all. So maybe all the shoes which are spread out all over the place end up in the same rack, and then we can start bringing people in and do tours.
The tutu that we were talking about today, where did this particular one come from?
This particular tutu we purchased several years ago when Scottish Ballet were moving from their home in the West End to their new location on the south side of Glasgow. And we managed to raise a little bit of grant money, and we went and selected a few key costumes to come into the collection. And this one in particular is the classic. It's the Swan Lake, which was a perfect one to be one of those key objects to acquire from that sale.
Obviously, this is an audio recording we're doing just now. So for anyone listening, could you describe what you and I can see in front of us?
Yeah, so this is a very lavish tutu, and partly because it was designed by Jasper Conran, who is famous for his kind of clothing designs, but not necessarily theatrical wear. So it's probably just got that little bit extra embellishment that we would sometimes see. So the bodice is a white velvet, and then it's been embroidered, and we've got net on it as well, and feathers. The skirt itself, the tutu, is built up with layers and layers of tulle, and then on the top, to represent the swan, there are feather wings on either side, and then over that he has then embroidered the outlines of feathers in glass and beads. It took a lot of work, and he drafted in the Embroiderers Guild in Glasgow to come and help with all this fantastic embroidery on the surface. It would have twinkled underneath the lights. I do feel some of this handiwork would not have been seen if you'd been sat at the back of the stalls.
Before doing this interview, I was trying to discover where the origins of the word tutu itself came from. And I just wondered if you had a theory about that or an interpretation of where you think it came from.
I know that the earliest one that's closer to the tutus that came in, they started to be developed in the early 19th century, where you've got Mairi Taglioni, who was the first woman who went on point. She was wearing the slippers of the day. They were called slippers, but they're not kind of great big furry things that we might wear today. They were just little satin shoes. And she went up on the tips of her toes, which means ballet dancers have had to do that ever since. And those skirts were made using a net, and this was a machine net that had started to be produced commercially and industrially in the early 19th century. Those skirts, you can see, are just slowly getting longer. So if you look at the fantastic Duggars in the Burrell collection, you can see that their skirts by that point are up from the calf and around the knee. And then in the late 19th century, around the 1880s, you start to get the big white Russian ballets coming in.
How would the design of the piece you've chosen influence the dancer and the movements while they were wearing it?
Yeah, so obviously ballet costume, the most important thing is that the dancer's got to be able to move about. When ballet first was invented, and this is in the 17th century in the French court, you were wearing fashionable dresses of the time, so women were in long skirts. And then slowly, as footwork becomes important, they raise above the ankle. When in the early 19th century, Mairi Taglioni goes on point, then her skirts get that little bit shorter, and you get the romantic tutu that's at the knee. And then huge revolution in the end of the 19th century when you're beginning to get the big famous ballets that we're now aware of, Swan Lake, Nutcracker. You get this radical short tutu that's almost like a disc, and this means that not only can you see the footwork, you can see the legs, and you start to get the most fantastic long arabesque lines, those lines with the legs in the air.
Presumably it's a lot more comfortable for the dancer now than it would have been.
I think every dancer would have been comfortable in the clothing of the time. The clothing looks odd to us, but if that was closer to what you were wearing every day, the costume, if it's well made for you, so certainly a principal dancer that will have a costume made for them, that should be well fitting. Otherwise, it's going to impede. They're going to be constantly thinking, oh, this doesn't fit, and not concentrating on their line.
How would you care for a costume like that on an ongoing basis if it's being used in performance?
Well, this is where you've got to have a fantastic wardrobe mistress and team. So certainly this tutu here was made for the lead dancer, Fiona Chadwick, who was on loan from the Royal Ballet. And it was probably only worn by her when she came up as a guest. So that's why it's still in quite good condition. So yes, the dancers are rather like the swans themselves, all beautiful on top, looking calm and serene, doing fantastic arabesques. But underneath, paddling away, their feet are getting it.
Ouch.
Yes. Ouch.
Becky, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Fascinating to hear from Alan and Becky there, and it's always exciting to get inside one of those big stores at the Resource Centre.
This piece is exceptional. It really conveys the story of the ballet that it was made for, which is Swan Lake. It looks like a swan, a dying swan. So it would convey story in the same way that the dress we were speaking about before would do. Now, the tutu has seeped into popular culture. It's not just something that's worn by ballet dancers. Today, we might think first of Carrie Bradshaw at the beginning of Sex and the City.
We're back at Burrell now, and we've rather gracefully moved into the North Gallery to start thinking about our next object. The focus of our third story this week would have needed to move with the same kind of coordination, control and balance as a ballet dancer. Mairi, have you any ideas who or what we might be looking at next?
Yes, they are the boxing gloves of Glasgow boxing hero Benny Lynch, who won the world flyweight title in 1935.
That's right, the gloves themselves are in storage, but Michael's been over to the Boxing Academy in Govan to find out more about Benny and to find out more about the sport as practised in the city today.
As you come in, you'll see it says Glasgow Boxing Academy. It says turn up, shut up and train. That's it. Yeah. Get here. If you can get here, you're halfway there. I am Gary Porter. I'm head coach here at Glasgow Boxing Academy based in Govan in Glasgow. So yeah, we've got an amateur boxing club here. We've got seniors and juniors. We've also got a keep fit class that we're on once a night when we're opened as well. We use that as a kind of pathway for young folk to come through that want to learn how to box is part of that. Both senior and our juniors are competitive amateur boxers, and we're affiliated to Boxing Scotland as well.
You know, Glasgow's obviously got a real proud heritage of boxing. What is it that you think is important about the sport?
I think the sport offers a heck of a lot. It's probably an underrepresented sport in the city, even though, you know, it's very popular. If you look at it in comparison to other sports, football, possibly even rugby and other sports like that, it's underrepresented. But I think it's easy accessible. I mean, one of the things I tell folk when they come to the gym is just turn up. You don't need much. We'll give you a loan of gloves, we'll give you skipping ropes. You know, you pretty much, especially when it's kids, it's a case of turn up the way you would to PE at school. Yeah. So it's fairly accessible, and you know, as much as equipment can cost you a lot of money, most gyms will provide that. And I think what it kind of develops in gyms is that kind of team spirit, even though it's an individual sport as well. So it offers a lot of opportunities, I think, to keep fit, keep healthy for a lot of folk, and a fairly easy and accessible sport.
So you spoke there about the kind of physical benefits there that people get from coming here. Is there kind of mental health benefits that people get from coming to the club as well?
Hugely. I think over the last few years as well, it's been well documented that the impact boxing has had on mental health, probably not a lot of high profile boxers. There's also been the other side of that, and you know, there's been a lot made recently about those that when they finish boxing, the impact that it had on them in terms of what they've lost with that structure and routine. So I think there's a heck of a lot to be said about what boxing can do in terms of positive mental health.
Am I right in saying that there's representatives here from Team Scotland and GB as well?
Yeah, so at the front we have a wall, a kind of wall of fame. If you medal in any competition, you go in that wall. Bit of recognition in terms of what they've achieved, and it's also kind of spurs on some of the younger guys and girls in the gym that maybe haven't competed and are looking to. We've got a couple of lads that won Scottish titles and have represented at Great Britain Championships as well last year. I've currently got the Scottish heavyweight champion, Israel Erinalua. And I've got a young lad, Aaron Brown, who had won his second silver medal 2 years down at GB's last year as well.
And if anyone fancies a go and coming along, anyone's free to come along, is that right?
Yeah, turn up, shut up and train. That's it.
Brilliant.
It's Neil McLean here that works for the British Boxing Board of Control.
Neil, what does boxing mean to you?
It's just our life, to tell the truth. I mean, I'm 62 now, but it's always been there, you know, since I started boxing in the late 70s. Yeah. And as we say, it's all there is. You've got social media now, but when we were young, there was none of that, you know. And you went along to the local gym, and it was just pure escapism, you know. And you got to meet other people. People, you then talk. You know, some people that are shy, timid, they get out there, get the gloves on, hit the pads, and somebody would talk to them and then go in there, a wee spar after so long, you know, when they were allowed. It was just a great time, you know. And as Gary said again, it was it didn't cost anything, practically nothing, you know. So it was kids that were on the streets, really. Some people that didn't have any. I mean, it was a great escape for them, you know. They could go in there and got them out of their parents' room for a wee bit, you know. But it was just fantastic times, you know.
Do you think there's something special about Glasgow's relationship with boxing?
Yeah, I think it always has been, especially when we go talking about Benny. It was, it's always been a working class city. Everybody's known that. And back in the day, you know, you look at all these shipyards, you see them coming out, just thousands. It was just blackness with the donkey jackets, you know, and Porterfield Road and Renfrew, all these places, like Babcock's and Wilcox, Singers. It was just a working class, and it was like released to a lot of people, you know. And if there was a local guy that was going to box, I mean, these They talk about the arenas now, but see back in the day, like Firhill and these places, you know, they were stowed. See, any time there was a fight, and there was fights all the time. Like practically every week there was a big show. You had these great promoters like Peter Keenan and these guys, you know, and they're putting these shows on, and they went in their droves, because it was like a Friday night or a Saturday night. It was like, you know, it was like they go to the pictures now or something like that. But then as they go to a big fight, you know, and it was great, and it brought on a lot of these great fighters, and then the kids, they'd want to box, you know. So it's always been a thriving community, you know.
Brilliant.
What do these gloves say to you?
They say two things. One, when I'm looking at them, there's this particular patina on them, and that patina comes from pummeling the daylights out of somebody, but also comes from a form of discipline, repetitive, endless training that allows a boxer to be a disciplined sports person. Boxing is like a performance. There's a beginning, a middle and an end, and it's like watching a play. You don't know how it's going to end, but you're enthralled from the beginning to the end, and the boxer's in charge of how that story unravels.
Let's look at where we've been this week before we head into our last story. We went to the movies with costumer Graham Hunter, and from there deep into our stores to look at a rather beautiful tutu. We then hopped across the city to the Glasgow Boxing Academy. To wrap up this week, we're back in Borough, and we're standing rather fittingly in a gallery that's all about getting dressed up and looking your best. I can see jewellery, I can see makeup boxes, wigs, I can see a Rembrandt self-portrait, and I can see our next object. Now, it's not a suit of armour, it's known as a harness of armour. It's dazzling.
You wouldn't need to know much about armour to be able to tell that this is a person of a certain status. It would have cost a lot of money, and the workmanship that has gone into it as well is exemplary. This looks like it didn't see much battle. It looks like it was made by very skilled craftspeople, and it looks like it was worn by somebody of the nobility, because it would have cost a lot of money.
Well, Anthony was speaking to Ralph, our curator of Arms and Armour, to find out a little bit more about this object.
Hello, my name's Anthony. I'm a modern apprentice at Glasgow Museums, and I'm here today with Ralph Moffat, the curator for European Arms and Armour. Ralph, firstly, thanks for talking to us.
Yeah, no problem.
What are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at fantastic armour, full plate armour, called a harness, made around 1515, and it's a type of armour known as a Maximilian armour. Now, the reason for that is its distinctive style. If you look at these series of ridges right across much of the armour, what this does is it recreates the shape of the type of clothing worn at the court of Emperor Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this is a later name for it, but if you think of artwork, think of those portraits of Henry VIII, where he has these huge sleeves, and there's sort of slashes in the sleeves, fancy materials pulled through. So this whole armour is fashionable at that time because of this design, fluting.
And who would have worn that kind of armour?
Someone who could afford it, but someone like a knight or a man-at-arms who's a soldier who hasn't been knighted yet. This is armour that's going to protect you in battle. Your life depends on it. So you invest as much as you can.
So it would have been used in combat. It wasn't just kind of showpiece or for kind of ceremonial or jousting use. It was actually for actual combat.
Yes, there are various features about this armour that let us know it's for both mounted combat on horseback and for foot combat as well. So for example, that bit that's sticking out on the breastplate there, that's called a lance rest, not for resting your lance on, but for arresting the backward motion of the lance. It will shoot back under your arm when you're charging at an enemy. So what you do is you charge in with the enemy. And an armour like this, you'd also have armour on your horse. You burst through the enemy if you could. You'd take as many out with your lance, and once you've broken the lance or once you've come off your horse, you're ready to fight on foot.
So once, say, a knight had been dismounted, what would that feel like to wear? Would it have been quite cumbersome?
That's a question that comes up a lot. And what I always say is, it would be to you and I, people who don't fight in armour, who've never worn armour in our lives. We know from household accounts that Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, was 7 when he first had armour made for him. Now, if you've been wearing armour from when you're 7, he fought his first battle when he just turned 16, but you'd be able to run in that armour, you'd be able to jump in that armour, you'd be able to get up on your horse. So, yes and no, cumbersome to us, but to someone who trained in it, someone who's familiar with it, it's a trade-off between protection. So, for example, the breastplate is incredibly thick. other parts of the steel have been hammered thinner. There's flexibility because of the clever engineering, give a remarkable amount of mobility. So cumbersome to you and I, but not to someone who would fight in that armour.
And you were saying that it's in the Maximilian style, so that's German, I'm assuming?
Yes.
And how would that compare to what was kind of being worn in Scotland and the British Isles at that time?
That's a really good question. We know that James III was gifted a German-style armour, so that would be one with quite a distinctive style, slightly different to this armour we're looking at. One of the reasons we have some very fine armours made in the armoury, Royal Armoury set up by Henry VIII at Greenwich, is because Henry kept receiving gifts of fine armour from Maximilian, and he wanted to have fine armours made himself, so he set up his own workshop. He brought in craftsmen who were called the Almains. Anyone who speaks a version of German at that time, German-Dutch, was called an Almain. So he set up his own workshop because he wanted fine armours to be made. So whether you would have seen armours like this in Scotland or England, it is difficult to say, but no reason why not. No reason why not. Gifted to noblemen and purchased by noblemen. In Scotland, by law, anyone who owned £10 worth of land or £10 worth of property had to show up to fight for 40 days for the defence of the realm, and you'd be expected to have what's called a complete harness of full armour.
Well, thanks for talking to us today, Ralph. That was really interesting. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Absolute pleasure.
We've been across the city. We've been to Riverside with Audrey Hepburn. We've been to the Bally with Jasper Conran and over to Govan to the Boxing Academy, and then back here to Pollock Park to look at some shining armour. Next time, we'll be hearing a little bit of this.
You know, once in a while, if you try and see it all the way, it connects to other people at some unconscious level, and that's really what you're after, that existential moment that art and music can also give you.
See you next time on Curious City.